we are live, and it is another week of madness ahead right here on the Kev Baker Show. A big warm welcome to everyone out there, wherever you are. Like I say, you're tuned in to the Kev Baker Show. I'm Kev Baker, and tonight I'm joined by my good friend, the main man himself, Johnny Whistles. And I promise you, ladies and gentlemen, I can't think of a better start to the KBS week in a long, long time. We have got an amazing guest coming up. Mr. Mark Devlin is going to be live on the show. But before we get to Mark, Johnny Whistles, I'm absolutely buzzing, brother. I've been looking at this kind of music industry information all weekend and then today, and I just can't wait to get into some of this stuff tonight, John.
Yeah, this should be really good, Kev. I was watching a video today, and some of the things that our guests come out with, I had already knew, Kev, but some of them, it goes way, way deeper than anything that I had even known. And what a fantastic researcher and speaker, Kev. I'm really looking forward to this tonight.
Absolutely. I can't speak of this guy highly enough, and it's a real pleasure to bring him onto the show. But Johnny, in true KBS tradition, before we get to Mark, would you head into the Wookiee Cave and give these listeners a shout-out?
I'm in there just now, Kevin, the tinfoil hat area. And we start with our lovely moderator and host, Lucky. We've got 20 below. We've got Irish Pete, Anthony Norm Sakal. We've got Ozzy Anzac, the Mr. Bill Demarest, Brendan O'Shea, Calvin Long, Carl Saunders, Carol Smith-Rea, Caroline Smiley, who has two sisters. One, Hayley, absolutely gorgeous. I don't know her right enough. And then there's Heidi, an absolute nutcase. So males all over the world, just remember, Heidi is a nutcase. And we have Danny Goldsmith-Price, Dan the Sufferman, Darryl Bowles. We've got Devlin. We've got Do Wanna Know. We'll get Gaz, Jeff Phillips, Helen Alvanos, Atala Ma, James Goddard, Johnny Be Free, Joy Williams, Julie Gottsdiner, Kat Landry, Kieran Thomas, Kev Baker, Lost Stewart, Lichty Lass, the lovely Lynn Metcalf, Michelle Smith, we've got Moofish, Nancy Lalonde, Up Free World, good to see you. Peter Collins, Phil Gray, myself, Real Joe Wood, Reese Bevan, Sam Ramirez, the lovely Sarah Clough, Scottish John, Shane Virtue, the wonderful Star the Oracle, Stephen Gray, our sharer, and we've got Thomas Silk, Time Lord, Tony Phillips, last but not least, Kev, number 49, the wonderful Tracy Whitten.
Awesome stuff, and a big thanks to everyone who shared this over on the social media. Now then, tonight, we are going to be getting into the music industry. We're going to be lifting the veil a little and taking a look at the darker underbelly of that world. And, you know, to most people, the music industry represents a source of harmless fun and entertainment. But just beneath that glossy veneer, however, lies the devastating truth of who really controls these institutions and the deeply malevolent agendas for which they're being used. Tonight's guest, Mark Devlin, is a long-standing DJ and music journalist. Musical Truth is the culmination of his 5 years of research into the true nature of the industries and its objectives, from dark occult rituals to mind-controlled artists, and all points in between. This shows how these agendas fit into the wider picture of what's really going on in the world, and crucially, how the power lies with all of us to bring it to an end. And at long last, let's bring him on. Mark, welcome to the Kev Baker Show.
So no pressure after that intro then, Kev?
Listen, brother, I don't just say this lightly, honestly. Myself and Johnny, like we were saying, all weekend we've been kind of delving into this. And you, man, you know your stuff. You're so well researched, and that's why it's a privilege to bring you on here to speak to these listeners tonight. But, you know, before we launch into all this crazy music industry, Mark, let's get to know you a little bit. I mean, how did you end up getting into writing this book?
Well, I've told this story a few times this year since I brought the book out. The book's been out about 3 months, and I've done a whole bunch of radio interviews and public talks to promote the book, so quite well versed at it. Yeah, I've been a DJ for the last 26 years, a radio and club DJ, and during that time I was fortunate enough to play gigs all over the UK and in various different countries around the world, did a whole bunch of radio shows, wrote for some music magazines back in the day, Blues and Soul, Touch Magazine, a few bits and pieces for Mix Mag and others. And things reached the point in 2010 where, after 20 years of doing this, I finally came to some realizations about what's really going on in the world and who's really running things, and the fact that our perceptions of all of this are shaped and moulded and manipulated for us by unseen parties. So this was the tail end of quite a bit of reading and reflecting and musing on all the big questions in life. I'm always somebody that's considered these things, even though it didn't come across my radar big time during those early years of DJing. But by 2010, I'd been reading a whole bunch of books, not least the books of David Icke, but other authors. And it led me to these realizations. And there was a point in September 2010 where it was just like a light bulb going on in my head, and everything seemed to make sense. Everything came together. It's like the veil had been lifted, and I was able to see things so clearly that up to that point had been concealed and occulted. And I very quickly set about trying to understand how I'd been duped and deceived for so long. But what I really wanted to know was how the industry that I'd been a part of for so many years, the music industry, was being utilised as part of a massive agenda of mind control and social engineering and shaping of people's values and belief systems. And so I threw myself into that research, and as you just mentioned, it was a 5-year process before I brought the book out this year. So it was me just delving headfirst into a whole world of information. And as we were saying off air before the show started, the stuff that happens in the music industry is just one strand in a massive web, and there are so many other subject areas that we could be talking about in terms of how it fits into the big picture of what's going on in the world. We could be talking about false flag terror events, we could be talking about banking and financial scams, we could be talking about geopolitical stuff, chemtrails, fracking, any of that. The music industry is just one part of it, and even that alone is so multifaceted that we could literally be sat here talking for days and days about how it's being used. So the subject area is immense, and that's why it took so long to research. That's why the book is 170,000 words across 536 pages, and that's just volume 1. There's going to be a volume 2 because there's still so many stories yet to tell.
Absolutely, and with it being the music industry, you were sharing before the show, and I can imagine this evolves daily as every big new artist comes along or new video comes out. There must be more that sets your mind alight. But I used a couple of popular artists for the promo. We've got Lady Gaga,
Yep.
We've got Rihanna, and you can't watch their videos without being bombarded by symbolism. And you know, when the light bulb goes on, as you call it, once you know these symbols and you can recognise them, you see them everywhere, Mark. What is going on there?
Yeah, you do. And one of the things I'm really trying to get people to come round to is becoming symbol literate. I think it's very important that people learn to spot these symbols and understand what they're being used for. So things that we see time and time again in music videos, proving that all these artists are just manipulated stooges and puppets, because half the time I think this stuff is spliced into their videos and put into their stage shows, and the artists themselves don't even know until the thing hits MTV or, you know, it is all over the TV networks. It's only then that they see there's pyramids everywhere and all-seeing eyes everywhere, and things like Masonic and Kabbalistic mystery school image everywhere. And symbols themselves, of course, as I'm sure many people understand, are neutral in their base state. So a symbol is not evil as such until it's taken on board by some kind of party or some kind of group, and then some sort of will or intent is infused into the symbol. So if you take a pyramid, for instance, in its base form, it's neither good nor evil, and it can be used for very positive, empowering, benevolent purposes. But if it falls into the hands of dark occultists and Satanists, and they then charge it with energy that represents their belief systems and things that they want to manifest into reality, then when that symbol gets inserted into a music video or a stage show, and it's come from that source, it carries some of that dark energy with which it's been infused. And so then people viewing it in that context from that music video or from that stage show are making an energetic connection with what that symbol represents. And in that case, that can be very malevolent, and it doesn't have humanity's best interests at heart, shall we say. So, whether it's Lady Gaga or Rihanna or Beyonce or Katy Perry or Kesha or Christina Aguilera or Miley Cyrus or any of these artists, you're seeing the same symbols popping up all over the place. And it just proves that these individuals are products of the corporations. They're nothing more than foot soldiers, and they're just doing the bidding of those that control these industries. And they're using music videos now and the songs themselves in terms of what goes into the production, what goes into the lyrics, what goes into the overall imagery for some very nefarious purposes. It's all done on a subconscious basis. It's all aimed at the subliminal mind below the threshold of conscious thought. So people, and mainly kids, let's be straight about it, the target audience for artists like Miley Cyrus and Rihanna and Katy Perry and Lady Gaga are young people, children, and primarily girls. And if you narrow it down to an age range, it's probably girls of about 8 or 9 up to about 15 or 16. That's the core target audience. So that's who they've got in their crosshairs, are kids. And they're bombarding them with all this evil, deeply malevolent stuff that's being absorbed into their subconscious minds. And psychologists and scholars into this area, even in the mainstream, will tell you that stuff that you absorb into your subconscious can have a bearing on your thoughts and your perceptions, the way you see the world, the way you see yourself and how you fit into it, and your morals and your value systems. So kids are having all this stuff shaped for them in their subconscious minds without any idea that it's going on, and with, in most cases, their parents having no idea what's going on. So that's why it becomes vital to communicate this information to people and get it out there as widely as possible so people can start making responsible, informed choices, particularly parents of kids that are, soaking up all this stuff. So that's why the information in my book really needs to be understood by large numbers of people. It doesn't matter whether it's coming from me or it's coming from another researcher, but one way or the other, this information has to get out there because it's magic, basically, magic with a K, and it's dark, ceremonial, occult magic that's being applied. And, I think people would need to know and would like to know that this is going on.
And, you brought up magic with a K there. And that makes me think of one character in particular, somebody we're quite familiar with on the show.
Well, I think I know who you're thinking of.
Aleister Crowley. And, I was brought up not too far from Boleskine House that Jimmy Page even bought as well, Mark. Yes. Why is it we see music videos and the artists themselves absolutely in love with this character, Aleister Crowley?
Funnily enough, I was in Crowley's birth town yesterday, Leamington Spa. That's where he hailed from. And he was
synchronicity, eh?
Yeah, really. And he was the heir to a brewing family, a brewery. And it was an ultra-orthodox religious home that he was born into. And he seems to have rebelled against all of that and just wanted to seek out the antithesis of his conservative Victorian upbringing. And so he veered towards the dark occult. You mentioned Boleskine House there. I heard that it burnt to the ground last year. Did you hear about that?
Oh, not only that, Mark, but I will send you a video that my brother and his friend shot. They went to the house when it was in ruins. They're doing a kind of walk through the place. There's definitely paranormal activity. But in one of the rooms as well, there's evidence that the property was still being used by certain groups for Ouija board sessions, stuff like that. So that raises the question, just what happened to start that fire in a seemingly kind of uninhabited house?
Well, it really does. And I've made the point many times. I talk about Boleskine House in my public talks, and I say that it's not the sort of place that I would want to spend a night, but maybe that's just me. So there's been this...
the very famous picture of Jimmy Page, and you show it in some of your lectures. He's in the front kind of driveway.
Yeah.
Where that picture's taken from, there's actually a big stone pine cone Now, the pine cone symbology, you can trace that to the Vatican, and it's said to represent the pineal gland. And with knowing what we know about Aleister Crowley, I think it probably does. But the place itself, Mark, it's got a feel about it.
Yeah, I can well believe that. I would like to visit and just kind of, experience that atmosphere, but not spend a night there, just make a day trip, So Aleister Crowley has been an absolute fascination for so many rock musicians over the years. And another thing that I mention in all my talks, I make the point that there should be no connection at all between dark occult rituals and Satanism and this character Aleister Crowley, who espoused all of that and was the figurehead for a whole bunch of secret society networks and dark occult groups such as the OTO, the Order of the Golden Dawn, the AA, and rock music, entertainment. Why should there be any connection there at all? And then you can factor in other elements. In my book, I show that there are suicides and overdoses, so-called, everywhere. There's paedophilia and satanic ritual abuse, child abuse, everywhere, all linked to the entertainment industry, this is. Then you have the fingerprints of the military intelligence institutions, such as MI6 and the CIA, everywhere, and the ever-present influence of Aleister Crowley and his dark occult teachings. So if the music industry is really all about fun and entertainment and having a laugh and forgetting all the pressures and stresses of your life at the end of the working week and letting your hair down at the weekend, then why do we find all these elements interwoven into the backstory of the industry decade after decade after decade, as we do? So Aleister Crowley has been revered by everyone from the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, who were into him big time, to Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin, as we've just mentioned, who jumped at the opportunity to purchase Boleskine House with its very dark and checkered history. And then Elton John, David Bowie, people like that. Even Daryl Hall of Hall & Oates, who's not a guy that you would imagine to be attracted towards dark occult practices from his public image, but he's expressed that he absolutely adores the works of Crowley and he sees himself as a modern day version of him. He made that comment in an interview. You have Jay-Z at some point sporting a sweatshirt with "Do What Thou Wilt" on it, which is part of Crowley's famous phrase, "Do what thou wilt should be the whole of the law." So throughout the generations and all these different genres, there's been this absolute reveration of Crowley and his various works. And so the question arises, why should this be? And when you get down to the true nature of the individuals and the groups that control and direct the music industry and everything else, Hollywood movies, the television industry and all the rest of it, it turns out to be basically a dark religious priest class. When you get to the very tip of the pyramid, to use that analogy, the control structure, what you find is a dark occult priest class who are obsessed with various ritualistic practices and ceremonial magic, and they're obsessed with numerology and symbology, and that is filtering down through the levels until it gets to these artists that we see paraded as the household names, the A-list celebrities that everyone's heard of. That's why we see all this stuff in their videos and stage shows and record sleeves and stuff. It's been going on for decades, basically since the start of the industry. But I have noticed, and other researchers have pointed out, that in the last few years, maybe the last 7 to 8 years or so, they've been stepping up the agenda big time in terms of the mind control that's going on. And you can look at what's happening in the wider world and the way they're stepping up the New World Order agenda, and they're, trying to bring in this Orwellian 1984 Brave New World type state ever quicker by the day. And so what's been happening in the music industry seems to be going in tandem with all these other societal changes that are just being ramped up big time. So it makes you wonder, where is it all leading? What is so crucial about these times? Why are they throwing everything they've got at us, plus the kitchen sink, right now?
Well, Mark, you would think that with all that's actually going on in the music industry and even in Hollywood and things like that, that there would be a lot of people that would be willing to actually speak up about it, but that never ends well, really. And I think I found on your video today that the elite, or the people who actually take out these stars, they don't get even. They wait until a time where it's good for them to do these things. And what that also does is, see, because it's from, say, an actor speaking about the Illuminati or the music industry or anything like that, this was years ago that was spoke about. So it doesn't ever look as if it's these top companies who are getting rid of these people in the first place, because it makes people sound ridiculous then.
Yeah, well, the example that I've cited recently is Prince. And in some of my public talks, I've pointed out some of the stuff that Prince has said in interviews or is alleged to have said in interviews. I mean, some of them are provable, such as his comments about chemtrails. He appeared on this Tavis Smiley chat show in 2009 and spontaneously just started talking about chemtrails, which is not the sort of thing that celebrities are supposed to raise on a chat show. But it wasn't just that. I mean, Prince in the mid-90s got into this legal dispute with his record company, Warner Brothers, over the nature of the contract that he had with them and his publishing rights, his royalties, and his ownership of his own master tapes. And this was a legal case that went on for years and years and years. And during, while it was going on, Prince took to having the word slave written across his face. So you can imagine these would all be actions which would pee off his record company, and they wouldn't be too happy about it. And then he's alleged to have said other things in interviews. I can't find the actual interview where this quote is said to have come from, but it was a meme that started floating around after his death. And Prince is supposed to have said, "The genocidal Jews that control the music industry are the reason I will never play Israel." Now, if he really did say that, you can imagine how it would have hacked off certain parties. And I think that these individuals that we're talking about bear grudges, they don't forget, but they are prepared to play the long game. And we've seen examples of this so often.
It's just a coincidence, Mark, that he happened to die on the Queen's birthday.
Well, of course,
Prince, of course.
Of course it is, Kev. I mean, the odds of it happening are billions upon billions upon billions to one. But yeah, it's just one of those coincidences, and these things do happen.
And of course, everywhere in the world turning purple. And John was even telling me about a purple kind of beer that was out, Johnny.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think it was called Purple Rain, but
it was,
REIG.
Well, that's right. The Green King pub chain, the largest pub chain in the UK.
Oh, come on, King.
What?
We're having a king as well now, so now we've got a queen, a king, and a prince.
Oh, yeah, well, there you go. Yeah, so, the Green King pub chain unveiled this new beer called Purple Rain, as in, rain, the Queen's reign, get it? And this was just a few days before the Queen's 90th birthday celebrations. And it just happened to coincide with Prince dying at the age of 57 in a lift of the flu, like you do. Happens every day. And so this Purple Rain beer, they rolled out a whole bunch of advertising and promotional stuff to go with it. It's purple pumps to go on the bars and purple beer mats and purple posters and stuff. And then you had all these monuments around the world, such as Niagara Falls and the Empire State Building, being illuminated in purple. And the official story for it was, it's to mark the Queen's 90th birthday. I've never known her to be associated with purple before, but apparently this year she was. And, Prince just happens to have died on the same day. But like I was saying, these dark controllers play the long game, and they display incredible patience. So they are prepared to wait years and decades sometimes to see their agendas play out, and they just sit tight and wait for when they deem the time to be right. And I think there was a lot of ritual symbolic significance to Prince passing away when he did, in some very suspect circumstances, all tied in with the Queen's birthday. And so it's quite conceivable to me that back in the mid-90s, when he was speaking out against Warner Brothers, he was already making enemies in the industry. And it might have been decided then that Prince's days were numbered, but they were prepared to wait 20 years or whatever it was before they finally took him out, because they wanted everything to be in place symbolically. And they deal with numerology, they like their numbers, they like their dates. They are also into astrology, and they're into planetary conjunctions. And, the phases of the moon and that sort of stuff is all very important to the people that we're talking about. And they are prepared to wait until all that stuff is in place and is deemed to be right before they carry one of these things out. So I think there are kind of political reasons why certain artists are taken out. You can look at somebody like John Lennon, somebody like Bob Marley, even Michael Jackson, and you can understand why the industry might choose to remove these individuals. They become liabilities. They're not playing ball with the agenda. They're becoming too outspoken. They're veering their fan base off down in a particular direction, which might be contrary to what the industry wants, and so the decision is taken to take these artists out. But once that decision is taken, it's then done in a ritualistic fashion in line with their religious belief system. So, they're not only removing a troublemaker, but they're achieving some kind of, dark occultic aim along with it.
Multi-layered as usual, and thanks to guys like Mark Devlin here, you are all going to have the eyes to see these things when they play out in real time, because they keep on coming at us. And we'll be back right after the break to get into more of this brilliant information. You can check out Mark's work at musicaltruth.blogspot.co.uk. Stay tuned, we'll be right back. Oh, awesome. That's got to be the fastest half of a show ever.
It really is. Yeah.
Honestly, man. Wow. Where would you like to go next, Mark?
Well, I've been doing a lot of studying of the 1960s era in recent times. The Laurel Canyon thing, the hippie scene that came out of LA, LSD, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Timothy Leary, and
Johnny will tell you, Laurel Canyon. I only found out about Laurel Canyon during the course of doing the Kev Baker show,
right?
And I was blown away by it, man.
Me too. Me
awesome.
Too.
I'd never even heard of Laurel Canyon.
No, me neither. I mean, I'm reading Dave McGowan's book at the moment, and I can't put it down. It's just absolutely fascinating. And I've just watched Easy Rider this evening, because the movie Easy Rider is so loaded with what the agenda was in that part of the 60s.
I find that films that you've seen when you were younger, yeah, they were good films, but now you can go back and watch them again, and they've got a totally dual meaning.
With fresh eyes, you see so much that you've missed. You can watch a movie like 10 times, and then on the 11th viewing, you suddenly see things that made no sense before, but when they're put into the context of other understandings that you've now got, it all makes sense. That movie makes total sense to me now in terms of what it was being used for.
See, towards the end of the show, Mark, we have our Nano Girl coming on tomorrow night. She comes on once a week, and she speaks about like the transhumanism kind of stuff and that.
Okay.
So even if we could touch on some of the symbolism on that at some point towards the end, because that's, myself and Johnny, we cover that a lot. And it's interesting how you talk about the symbolism in the music, because I've never really looked for the transhumanist side of it, but like you say, once you start looking for it, it really is there.
I like to talk about transhumanism, so do ask me the question.
Yeah, because it's definitely where they're taking us for whatever reason. It seems to be like they think it's the next evolutionary step.
Yeah. You see, I could always see there was something wrong with this push towards technology. I mentioned earlier that I was basically a zombie until 2010. And
we all were.
Yeah. But even during my zombie years, I could still see that there were certain things wrong.
Zombie years.
Like I always knew the royal family were wrong-uns, and I always knew that we should not be tolerating them.
As a young kid, I used to wonder, well, how does one family get everything, and yet we're all supposed to be equal?
Well, I did too. And I didn't like the way technology was going in terms of we're being steered off towards digital, electronic ways of doing things, and everything is done by frigging computers now. And I never felt comfortable about that, and I thought there was something unsettling about it. And now I understand what transhumanism is. I can see why I didn't like it, because I can see where it's headed.
Welcome back, everyone, to tonight's broadcast right here on Truth Frequency Radio Network of The Kev Baker Show. With me, obviously, Kev Baker, my other co-host here, Johnny Whistles. And tomorrow night, don't forget, Nano Girl will be live right here. But tonight, we are joined by the quite brilliant, and I promised you this guy would be good. The chat room are loving you, Mark, but you can find Mark's work over at musicaltruthbook.blogspot.co.uk or djmarkdevlin.blogspot.co.uk. Now then, Mark, in the course of your research, how far back does this go? Because I think we could probably maybe aim for the 50s, 60s. What's your opinion on that?
Pretty much mid to late 50s, I would say, when it all kicked off. That could be traced back to pretty much the birth of the corporate music industry as we understand it today. You know, it was the rock and roll era onwards, really. And it started in America with Bill Haley and the Comets, going forward to Elvis Presley and all those artists that emerged out of that scene. And then over in the UK, it would have been the emergence of people like Cliff Richard, a young Cliff Richard, who's been in the news lately, hasn't he?
Just a little bit. What do you make of that whole debacle?
I think when you're a sir, it's the gift that keeps on giving.
It seems to be a lot in common, these sirs, don't they?
Well, yeah, and in my story in the book, there are so many sirs and lords that just keep cropping up. And I see good old Rod Stewart took the MBE the other day, so he got there in the end, didn't he? Basically, anyone that's had a 50-year career, there's a reason why they've been allowed to continue that long. And in almost all cases, you'll find they're either a Sir or they're an OBE, MBE or CBE. Very few exceptions to that. But yeah, going back to the early days of the industry, it was the 1950s onwards. And I go into that in some of the early chapters in the book. And I talk about some of the connections between the early days of the British music industry specifically and some other unsavoury elements that you might not expect to be there. So with Cliff Richard thrown into that mix, we have early record producers like Kit Lambert, Robert Stigwood, Joe Meek, Brian Epstein of the Beatles. Then you can throw into the mix the Cray twins. What the hell are they doing in this story? What have they got to do with the music industry? Well, there's lots of interconnected links there. Then you get the Tory peer Lord Boothby, you get the Labour MP Tom Dryburgh, you get Winston Churchill thrown into it. And all this stuff came from an article written by a former British intelligence operative who went by the name of T. Stokes. And I detail the article in the book, and it shows all these links between military intelligence, and there's paedophilia thrown into it, and there's all these dark, ugly secrets, and, you know, the craze and all of that. Again, you know, the question arises, why should all this stuff be interconnected in any way? And then going forward into the 1960s, you have the emergence of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones pretty much simultaneously. And then we go forward to the second half of the 1960s, which is an absolutely fascinating period to cover, to research. And I've just thrown myself into this, and I've had my mind blown by the stuff that I've found. All these social changes that occurred on both sides of the Atlantic between about 1965 and the very end of the decade, 1969. It's absolutely incredible. The social fabric of the UK and the US in 1969 bore virtually no resemblance to the way it had been in 1960, because such a number was done on that youthful generation through the 1960s. So it was done through the music. You had the emergence of the psychedelic scene, and the hippie folk rock, country rock scene coming out of LA, Laurel Canyon and Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco. And then you had the changing music of the Beatles, which went very psychedelic and experimental around about 1966. And simultaneous with all of that, you had the emergence of LSD, big time, and also magic mushrooms and other stuff. And then when you factor in some of the other world-shattering events that occurred during the 1960s, such as the Kennedy assassinations, the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, then the Manson murders over in LA, and the faked Apollo moon landing, and the Vietnam War, and all this other stuff, even the Moors murderers, you know, Myra Hindley and Ian Brady here in the UK. So much stuff was going on. And when you get down to the fine detail of the research, which is what I've been doing in the weeks since my book dropped, you discover the fingerprints of the intelligence communities everywhere. So it's our friends in MI6 and MI5, and then the CIA, the FBI, the Tavistock Institute, and then other agencies such as Cambridge University in England seems to be involved, and then Stanford and Princeton universities in the US, in terms of all these social changes and all the stuff that was going on in the music scene and popular culture generally can be seen to have been directed by one of these agencies. In the US, it's pretty much entirely the CIA. And I've been doing, I've been listening to a lot of the work of Jan Irvin recently, who runs Gnostic Media, gnosticmedia.com. Thoroughly recommend that people take a look at his work, listen to the podcasts that he's done with a guy called Dr. Hans Utter, who's a musicologist, and also Joe Atwill, a fairly well-known researcher. Those guys have gone big time into the full extent of the infiltration of the CIA in shaping popular culture. And when we apply that to the 1960s, the emergence of LSD was no organic, random thing that just happened by chance. Guys like Timothy Leary and Michael Hollingshead and Ken Kesey, when they appeared on the scene, dishing out LSD and trying to coerce and encourage the young kids that were listening to all this tripped-out psychedelic music to go on these amazing journeys of discovery and expand their consciousness by taking LSD. That was all absolutely manipulated and absolutely according to an agenda. And again, it was no accident that the emergence of LSD coincided entirely with psychedelic music.
You know, Mark, listening to you here, it's almost like the 60s. We had the emergence of the CIA's MK Ultra programs, but the whole of the 60s sounds like an MK Ultra program.
Yeah, the whole decade just feels like a psyop, more than any other decade. And I make the point that by 1969, it was as if the agenda was pretty much done. You know, the Beatles broke up at the end of 1969, and I'm convinced now people have a real problem with this one for reasons I can understand. But I'm convinced that the Beatles were a product of the intelligence community. You know, a lot of people pin it on the Tavistock Institute and say that they came out of that particular institution. It may well have been, but either way, they, to me, seem like an absolutely controlled and owned group, and they were fulfilling an agenda throughout. So for the first few years, they put out what's been described as these bubblegum pop songs, you know, She Loves You and Love Me Do and From Me to You, and these were nice, pleasant, innocent sort of pop songs. But then round about 1966, the music started to change, and the whole Beatles agenda and their whole image and persona started to change. And it was all in tandem with all these other social changes. The LSD, the arrival of the birth control, contraceptive pill, you know, that came along at the same time, and that led to a change in attitudes towards sexuality. So the whole popular culture of that decade was being shaped. And I think by 1969, it was pretty much done, because the ripples from those few short years are still being felt today in terms of people's attitudes towards morality, sexuality, people's attitudes towards drugs, people's attitudes towards music. All of that was being fomented and cultivated in that second half of the 1960s. They did an absolute number on that generation. And the kids that were around at that time, that were coming of age, coming to adulthood in the mid to late 1960s, are the generation that was known as the baby boomers. So they were the ones that were born at the tail end of the Second World War, sort of mid to late 40s. And by the mid to late 60s, they were the ones in the crosshairs of the CIA and these other agencies in terms of completely having their social values and perceptions shaped for them. And also just steering them off down certain lifestyle directions, getting them hooked on drugs, getting them into this tripped out music, and steering them away from any kind of political activism where they could actually be some kind of danger or some kind of threat to the establishment. That's what social engineering is all about. You get people to think that these attitudes and these value systems are coming from them themselves, without them realising that it's all been shaped and moulded for them. And so they feel like they're going off down this completely natural route, whereas in fact the whole thing has been laid out for them. It's very cleverly done. It's a major trick of the intel community. And there are many researchers, Jan Irvin particularly, who will contest that the very reason for these agencies being set up, the CIA, maybe to a lesser extent MI6, certainly the Tavistock Institute and the Frankfurt School and institutions like that, was to shape and mould public values and perceptions and culture creation. So it's less about black ops and assassinations and all this dark Men in Black stuff, and more about shaping social values. That's the real reason for these agencies being put out there. And
Mark, there was a kind of mecca for this whole cultural shaping, and it was one place I'd never heard of until recently, and that is Laurel Canyon. What's going on at Laurel Canyon? Because I bet there's some people out there have never even heard of it.
Yeah, I'd not heard of it myself until a few years ago. But interestingly, last week I was in Ireland doing some talks for my book, and I was in this bed and breakfast in Dublin over breakfast, and I was reading Dave McGowan's incredible, fascinating book, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon. And there was a couple from New York that were sat at the next table, and they saw me reading the book, and they said, "Oh, we know about Laurel Canyon. Everyone in New York's heard of Laurel Canyon. It's a very strange place. You know, some strange stuff has gone on there." And I thought, yeah, you ain't kidding, from reading this book. Laurel Canyon is this neighborhood, very bohemian kind of neighborhood in the Hollywood Hills overlooking Los Angeles. And it's the place where pretty much all the key musicians that were a part of the counterculture scene, or what can be termed the hippie scene, from the mid to late 1960s, congregated and started producing their music. And all these musicians seem to have been drawn magnet-like or Pied Piper-like to this one particular community from all other parts of the States and from Canada and from the UK and various other places. And we're talking all the key names of that time, of that scene. So it would be the Mamas and the Papas, the Byrds, the Eagles, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, Buffalo Springfield, Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention, the Doors, the Beach Boys, the Monkees, Joni Mitchell, Joan Baez, Carole King, James Taylor, Jackson Browne, and a whole bunch of others. And for some reason, they all started hanging out in Laurel Canyon. Prior to that point, and this has all come through the research of a great researcher and author, Dave McGowan, who's sadly no longer with us. He died of cancer last year. But he did manage to put out this book in 2014, which is an absolute mine of information. So there was no music scene at all in Laurel Canyon, and very little of a music scene anywhere in Los Angeles prior to 1965. It was all centered around New York and Nashville. And for some reason, it just sort of blew up overnight. There were all these music clubs that were starting, all these recording studios, all these coffee shops and stuff where these musicians would play. And McGowan started looking into why this could be. And his research led him to digging into the family backgrounds of all these key players. And he discovered that pretty much without exception, the fathers of all these prominent musicians came from the military communities. So they're either in the Air Force or the Marine Corps or the Navy, or they came out of the CIA or the FBI or the Pentagon or the Defense Department or some other aspect of government defense, you know.
See, Mark, this sounds like this mind control again, because we've got this generational aspect to it now as well.
Exactly. I mean, it all works in tandem with all the other aspects. Mind control is everywhere. Generational satanic ritual abuse is everywhere, where the elite classes that we have presiding over everything actually mind control and traumatize their own children. That's the way they produce new generations of psychopaths to carry on the agenda. So, you know, a father will abuse his own son because he himself was abused by his own father a generation ago. And they've been doing this forever. And that's the way they keep these bloodlines going. And that's the way they keep these agendas going. So McGowan discovered you've got all these family backgrounds going into military intelligence. And also military intelligence and the dark occult seem to go hand in hand as well. It's all about occulting information. So that could be information about national security or, you know, mass social engineering programs, but it can also be information about how reality works, the nature of reality, and how to manipulate energy and the power of dark rituals and things like that. So military intelligence and the dark occult are definitely bedfellows. So McGowan uncovered many examples of these musicians that have long been held up as heroes of their era, poster children for this anti-war kind of counterculture scene. And the famous one is Jim Morrison of the Doors, who would appear to be not who we've been led to think he was. His father was Admiral George Stephen Morrison, it turns out, who was the US naval commander in charge of the fleet of ships that commanded the Gulf of Tonkin incident.
I even heard he was a president of the Philadelphia experiment, but I don't know if that's true or not.
Well, I've not heard that one, but he was certainly in charge of the naval fleet involved in the Gulf of Tonkin, and that was the event that springboarded the Vietnam War, basically. And yet, Jim Morrison has long been held up as the poster child for the anti-Vietnam War counterculture generation. Then you got Frank Zappa, who McGowan uncovered his father worked at the Edgewood Arsenal military base in Maryland on chemical weapons research. And yet Frank Zappa has always been held up as this hero and this icon and this legendary figure that's kind of sticking it to the man and, is against establishment and all of that. And it goes on and on and on. John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas. And when you listen to somebody like Jan Irvin and his research, he even goes into people like Bob Marley and reveals that Bob Marley's father was half Jewish, was a naval officer, British naval officer, and worked for a while on a slave plantation in Jamaica. And, Jan Irvin's got things to say about Jimi Hendrix and all these other iconic figures. So it leads you to wonder whether any of these iconic musicians emerged the way we're led to think they did, just organically and out of this grassroots movement, and there were just these wildly creative individuals that wanted to channel all their angst into their music, or whether they're operating through their families to some kind of agenda, some kind of mission. I mean, I'm conscious of the fact that with somebody like Bob Marley or Jim Morrison, you could say that they came out as these rebellious musicians as a way of sort of turning their back on their family backgrounds. And, maybe they were disgusted at what their fathers did and what they represented, so they came out and wanted to campaign against that. But none of them, to be fair, in any interviews have ever admitted to where they came from or what their fathers did.
You see, you would think they would turn around and say they were giving the middle finger to the authority, to their father or whatever, wouldn't you? But
well, you would.
They hide it away. That makes it all the more intriguing.
Yeah, we were talking about Aleister Crowley earlier on. I can't remember if it was on or off air, but we were talking about how when he came out as a dark occultist and he reinvented himself as the Great Beast, that was him pretty much giving his middle finger to his background, this very orthodox, strict, conservative, Victorian religious upbringing, and that steered Crowley off in the absolute opposite direction. And there are some people that argue that Jim Morrison and Frank Zappa and people like that may have been doing the same thing with their families. But again, the question remains, why did they never speak out about this? And there's all kinds of other strange elements that just make no sense as well, all kinds of anomalies and discrepancies. With the Doors, Dave McGowan has pointed out that they just seemed to appear overnight. They had no kind of musical history, and they couldn't even play their instruments when the band first emerged. They used session musicians for their recordings. Actually, a lot of the bands coming out of Laurel Canyon used session musicians, and there was this crew called the Wrecking Crew, which was commanded by Phil Spector, another interesting character, who actually provided a lot of the music for these Laurel Canyon bands like the Byrds, who never played their own instruments. So you think, well, how did these groups get so successful and come to be the figureheads of this whole new scene when they couldn't even play their friggin' instruments, There's all kinds of questions there. I just want to read out quickly an email or an excerpt from an email that I got from a listener to one of my podcasts, because I've learnt so much of all this subject area from people that have contacted me out of the blue, that have seen my public talks or read the book, and I get emails every day from people saying, have you looked at this information, have you looked at this researcher's work? And it's a great way of learning through people bringing that information to you. This listener sent me an email, and she was talking about this whole counterculture era and the idea that it could have been manipulated by the CIA, and she said, I believe that this dark agenda revolved around not only getting the best and brightest addicted to drugs and drink, loveless sex, and of course rock and roll, but that it was a carefully crafted campaign to undermine us at the deepest level of our spiritual core. Complete disempowerment from which many of us are still reeling and thankfully bouncing back from.
Wow.
And then she went on to say, who are the role models for young people today? Where are they? I can't think of a single one. Did they ever give us a sound, legitimate role model of any integrity, or just actors behind shallow scripts? And the more and more I delve into this, Kev, the more I'm coming to understand that appears to be the case. It's very devastating for people to accept that people they've held up as heroes and icons their entire lives could have been very different to what we've been led to believe and could have been operating to some agenda or other. But, it is what it is. Truth is truth. And you either go with it no matter where it takes you, or you live in cognitive dissonance and stick your head in the sand.
Absolutely, Mark. And you mentioned there where it's taking you and where it's taking us. And we want to touch briefly before you go. We've got 5 minutes. I mean, we've talked about this culture, the counterculture of the 60s. But now, the symbolism and where they're driving us, it's changed, and it's got a transhumanist aspect to it. And you've noticed this as well, haven't you?
I have, yeah. In videos of recent years, going back to around about 2007, I would say, that kind of time, I've noticed that there are various themes coming out in the music and in the videos. One of the things that that was a big red flag for me was the emergence of auto-tune. Are you familiar with
oh yeah
that technique? Yeah, this is a production method which makes a singer sound like a goddamn robot. And it's been around for, getting on for 10 years now. There was an artist called T-Pain who popularised it within the so-called hip-hop genre, although by then, the phrase hip-hop did not apply to the music that was coming out. The first record on which the public heard this technique would have been Cher, Life After Love, in 1996. So it was
a pure alien sound, that song from Cher.
It was, and the technique has been known ever since as the Cher effect, and that was kind of a testing ground for autotune. And then it was rolled out big time in the 2000s, to the point where there was a time around about 2008 where pretty much every mainstream so-called hip-hop, R&B and pop record had the vocals plugged into this autotune program. And I hate it. Every other DJ and every producer and every music maker I've ever spoken to hates it. So if everyone hates it, why is it everywhere? Why is it so prevalent? Well, in my view, it's a way of normalising the transhumanist agenda, which is where they want to take human society. It's the merging of humanity and technology. And they've got two facets to their plans as far as I can see. As far as the elites are concerned, they want to augment and upgrade themselves from mere humans to these technological entities where they can actually transcend death as they see it, transcend physical death. And we've heard stories of technology being made available whereby a person can upload their consciousness to a sort of cloud, technology, and it can then be transplanted into another human body. This is the sort of stuff that people like Ray Kurzweil talk about, of Google, who's one of the major proponents of the transhumanist agenda. And he's quite open about it. He says in public that this is the dream that we've got for technology, in that we can transcend death and, just send our consciousness forward into other bodies. So it seems to tie into this very sick, twisted belief system that the elites have about how they can reincarnate and, carry their consciousness on, and also extend their lifespans way beyond what has been the case for humans up to this point. And you've got people like David Rockefeller, who's 101 years old this year, who appears to be someone that's terrified of leaving his body. He just wants to stay in it for as long as possible. So that's one facet of it. But then for the rest of us, the great unwashed, the useless eaters, the goyim, that's you and me and everyone else listening to this probably, they've got a different kind of plan, which is they want us all microchipped, and they want us with things like brain implants, and they want us plugged into a giant computer grid, and they want technology ruling every aspect of our daily lives.
Oh, it's okay, Mark. We're already living in Glasgow, so we're there.
Yeah,
we live in their
smart city. Damn, what's the deal with that, man? I mean, what?
Oh, not good, bro, not good.
Well, we actually win it in a competition.
I know, that was the prize for a competition.
Weren't you lucky? So what is that? Is that you get lampposts recording your conversations, and you get...
Eventually, yes, that will feed back to a computer system in Tel Aviv, no less. And it will use clever algorithms to work out that people are raising their voices, or there's too many people congregating in one space. All the traffic lights will turn to red, so that the police can attend for a pre-crime. That is literally where they're taking us, Mark.
Lovely. And I actually joke about this, but it probably isn't even a joke. I joke about the fact that soon there'll be no requirement for human DJs, because what you're going to get is dance floors in clubs with sensors built in, all sort of smart, smart grids, similar to what smart meters do. And the sensors will detect how busy the dance floor is. Maybe they'll detect it through body heat. And that will send an instruction through to a computer system, which will be loaded with a bunch of music. And if it says, the dance floor's warming up now, and there's a whole bunch of girls on the floor, so you'd better play a Rihanna record to keep them happy. And so the computer system will automatically spew out a Rihanna record. I do joke about it, but I really think that could become a reality before long, because we've got warehouse workers being laid off in favour of robots. We've got driverless trucks and driverless cars hitting the roads. So how long before it permeates into every kind of job area?
We are almost there, brother. We are assimilating with the Borg as we speak. And Mark, the listeners are demanding that you come back sometime soon, as do me and Johnny. I have loved this tonight. You can check out Mark's work at musicaltruthbook.blogspot.co.uk. Can't get my words out tonight. But folks, wherever you are, make it TFR.